The letter hit the floor of the Red Mesa post office the same moment Alice Mercer's heart finished breaking for the last time. She did not bend to pick it up. She simply stared at it, the paper folded into thirds, the wax seal already cracked from where she had torn it open in a fury she could no longer contain. The postmaster, old Gerald Potts, was pretending to sort a stack of parcels behind his counter, but she could see his ears tuned toward her like a hound catching a distant sound. She did not care. She had stopped caring about what Red Mesa thought of her somewhere around the second broken promise, and this letter in her hand represented the seventh. 7 promises. 7 catastrophic failures. And this final one, from a man named Clifton Reed who had spent the better part of 8 months writing her letters from Tucson that were so full of devotion they practically glowed in the dark, had written to inform her, in careful and apologetic penmanship, that he had married another woman 2 weeks prior. He had not thought to mention it sooner. Alice was 26 years old and she felt ancient. She felt like the red rock formations that surrounded this dusty Arizona town, worn down by something relentless and patient, and utterly without mercy. She pressed her back against the wooden wall of the post office, closed her eyes, and made herself a promise that she intended to keep far better than any man had kept one to her. She was done. She was done with promises, done with letters that smelled of lavender water and hope, done with men who said they would come and then did not come, who said they would stay and then left, who said she was the only one and then turned out to have a second one waiting somewhere quiet and convenient. Done with the particular humiliation of being a woman alone on the frontier, who was foolish enough to believe that words meant something. She folded the letter once, twice, and pressed it flat against her palm. Then she walked to the small iron stove in the corner of the post office, the one Gerald kept burning through October because the desert nights could cut straight through you, and she dropped Clifton Reed's letter into it. She watched it curl and blacken and disappear. "Miss Mercer," Gerald said carefully, "you all right?" "Perfectly fine," Alice said, and walked out into the October sun of 1883 and into the rest of her life without ever looking back at that stove. She had arrived in Red Mesa 14 months ago to take up a position as the schoolteacher, which paid $32 a month, and came with a small house 2 blocks from the school that had a porch and a lemon tree in the yard. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, after her mother passed, and her brother married a woman who made it quietly clear that Alice was now a fixture rather than family in her own home. The frontier had seemed like possibility. The frontier had seemed like the kind of place where a woman with a quick mind and a capacity for hard work could build something that was genuinely hers. What she had not counted on was how lonely it would be. Red Mesa was a town of roughly 400 people, most of them men connected to cattle ranching or the copper mine 10 miles east. There were perhaps 40 women in the entire settlement, most of them married, and most of those marriages the practical kind, the kind that had more to do with survival than with any tenderness between 2 people. Alice had not wanted to be practical about love. That had been her first mistake. She had entertained correspondence with 3 men from the territory, 2 men from Colorado, and 1 man from Tucson. She had written honestly and read carefully. She had asked direct questions in her letters and tried to make sense of the answers. She had been, she believed, reasonable and clear-eyed. And each time, each single time, something had fractured. A man who promised to visit came down with a sudden illness that lasted exactly as long as his interest. A man who promised to write faithfully wrote twice and vanished. A man who promised he was unattached turned out to have a wife and 2 children in Santa Fe. And now Clifton Reed, who had promised something as simple as faithfulness, who had promised her, in his most recent letter before this one, that he was coming to Red Mesa in November to meet her properly. 2 weeks married, and he had not even had the decency to tell her before she had to read it in a letter she opened in public. The lemon tree in her yard was still producing fruit when she got home. She stood under it for a long moment in the afternoon light, breathing in the sharp, clean smell of it, grounding herself. The tree did not make promises. The tree simply produced lemons reliably, season after season, without fanfare or drama or betrayal. Alice thought she might love that tree more than she had ever loved any of those men. She went inside and made herself a cup of strong coffee and sat down at her small kitchen table and began planning how to be a woman who needed nothing from anyone. It was a good plan. She threw herself into it with the kind of energy that comes from genuine pain channeled into discipline. She rose early and taught her students well, 17 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and she was strict but fair, and she took a real pride in their progress. She expanded the lending library she kept in the school, spending her own money on books she ordered from a supplier in Phoenix. She planted a kitchen garden behind her house. She repaired her own porch boards when they splintered rather than asking anyone for help. She learned from the widow Hanson down the road how to preserve tomatoes and dry beans for winter. She was fine. She told herself this every morning while she braided her dark hair in the small mirror above her wash basin. She was fine. She was building something real. She was not waiting for anyone. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the middle of November, 3 weeks after she had burned Clifton Reed's letter, Jasper Maddox rode into Red Mesa and everything quietly, irrevocably shifted. She did not notice him at first. She was busy. She had 17 children demanding her attention, plus a leaking roof on the school building that needed the sheriff's help to get repaired, since the school board moved like cold molasses when it came to maintenance. She was at the general store buying chalk and a new slate board when he came in behind her, and she registered him only as someone tall enough to briefly block the light from the doorway. He was looking for work, and he asked Harlan Webb, who owned the general store, if he knew of any ranches hiring. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that did not seem to need anything from the room it entered. He had come from New Mexico by way of Colorado, he said, and he had been working cattle for most of the last 8 years, and he was handy with repairs as well, fences and structures both. Harlan Webb said Emmett Greer out at the Double Cross was looking for a hand since he lost 2 men to the Silver Rush up north. Jasper Maddox thanked him, bought a pouch of tobacco, and left. Alice barely looked at him. She had her chalk and her slate board, and she had a lesson to prepare. She was fine. What she noticed, and could not quite explain to herself, was that he had left a coin on the counter that was more than the cost of the tobacco and had not waited for change. Not as a grand gesture. He simply had not wanted to wait, and the extra cent or two was not worth the trouble of standing there. There was something in that small, thoughtless practicality that stuck with her in a way she could not immediately name. She pushed it aside and went back to her school. She did not think about Jasper Maddox again until 2 days later when her lemon tree fell. It had not exactly fallen. A section of the old trunk, which had a hollow place in it she had noticed but not worried about, gave way under the weight of an unseasonably early frost, and the whole upper half of the tree came down in the night, taking a section of her porch railing with it. She came outside in the gray morning light in her shawl and her boots, and stood looking at the wreckage with a feeling that was out of all proportion to a fallen tree. It felt like one more thing the world had decided to take from her, and she was aware that this was not a rational response to wood and bark and citrus, and she had it anyway. She was standing there fighting with herself about whether she was allowed to simply cry for a minute when she heard boots on the road and looked up. Jasper Maddox was passing on his way out toward the Double Cross, she assumed, since he was on foot and the ranch was in that direction, and he had a work bag over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw the tree. He looked at it, then at her, and he seemed to read whatever was on her face with a directness that did not feel intrusive, which was strange because she did not usually like being read. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, in the tone she used for keeping people at a comfortable distance. He looked at the tree again. He set down his bag. He said without any particular inflection, "I can move that off your railing before I head out. Won't take long." "I did not ask for help," Alice said. "No," he agreed. "You did not." He stood there a moment, and she thought he was going to pick up his bag and go, which was what she wanted. Instead, he said, "I have a saw in my bag. That section of trunk will take you the better part of an hour to move by yourself. I can clear it in 10 minutes. It's not a favor, it's just the practical thing." She looked at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, maybe 31, with a lean, weather-worn face and dark eyes that held very little performance in them. He was not trying to impress her. He was not trying to do something for her in order to get something back. He was simply calculating that 10 minutes of his time could save her an hour of struggle, and it seemed to him straightforward. "All right," she said. He cleared the fallen section of the tree in 9 minutes. She timed him out of something between suspicion and curiosity. He did it without commentary or complaint, stacked the wood neatly to the side of her porch so it could dry for firewood, and then he assessed the railing and said, "That post is cracked. The tree didn't cause it, just knocked it loose. It would have gone in a few months on its own. You should get it replaced before hard winter." "Thank you," she said, with more warmth than she had intended, because it was useful information and he had not dressed it up in anything. He picked up his bag and his saw. "I am Jasper Maddox. I am working at the Double Cross starting today. If you need that post replaced, I can do it on a Sunday. I charge fair rates. Not I would love to help you. Not it would be my pleasure." He charged fair rates. It was a transaction. There was something so distinctly not like a courtship move in it that Alice felt the armor she had been wearing for 3 weeks actually settle more comfortably on her shoulders rather than making her reach for more of it. "Alice Mercer," she said. "I will think about it." He nodded and walked on. She went inside and drank her coffee and thought about the way he had said he charged fair rates, as if she were a sensible adult who could make a sensible adult decision, without needing to be charmed into it first. She thought it was probably the most respectful thing any man had said to her in years. She hired him to fix the post. He came that Sunday with the right lumber already cut to size, which meant he had measured the post somehow during those 9 minutes with the tree, storing the information without making a show of it. He replaced the post in under an hour, charged her 60 cents, which she verified later with Harlan Webb was indeed exactly the fair rate for that kind of work, and left without lingering. She had expected him to linger. She had braced for it. All the men who came around with a practical excuse had, in her experience, an impractical agenda underneath it. She had been watchful the entire hour, waiting for the shift, the softening of the voice, the comment that angled toward personal territory. It did not come. She was left standing on her repaired porch feeling 2 things simultaneously, relief and something that was uncomfortably close to disappointment, which she immediately identified as a threat and locked away. The weeks passed. November deepened into December, and the desert nights became genuinely cold, the kind of cold that had no moisture in it, that simply took the warmth out of things. Alice kept her school running, kept her garden, kept herself busy with the 100 tasks of a woman living alone on the frontier. She saw Jasper Maddox occasionally when she went to the general store or when she passed the feed yard on her way to the post office, and they greeted each other with the brief nod of 2 people who have a professional acquaintance and nothing more. She noticed things about him despite herself, because she was an observant woman and she could not help what she observed. She noticed that he was one of the few men in Red Mesa who removed his hat when speaking to any woman, not just women of obvious social standing. She noticed that he did not seem to drink more than 1 whiskey in an evening, which was practically monasticism by Red Mesa standards. She noticed that when old Jonas Reardon's wagon wheel broke in the middle of Main Street one morning and the old man was struggling with it, Jasper stopped and helped him without being asked, and then went on without accepting Jonas's attempt to press coins on him. She was not keeping a list. She told herself she was not keeping a list. She was absolutely keeping a list. The crisis came in the 2nd week of December when Billy Crane, who was 13 years old and the brightest student in Alice's school, stopped coming. Billy's father was Ray Crane, who worked at the copper mine and drank heavily and had, according to the other children's whispered reports, started keeping Billy home to work on repairs around their property because he could not afford to hire anyone. This was not, strictly speaking, legal even by the relatively loose standards of Arizona Territory in 1883, but the school board was composed of men who had complicated relationships with Ray Crane, and none of them seemed inclined to address it directly. Alice went to the school board. They listened politely and did nothing. She went to the sheriff, Walt Hadley, who was a decent man but cautious in the way of men who had held a position for a long time and intended to keep holding it. He said he would speak to Ray Crane. He did not. She was sitting at her kitchen table on a Saturday evening with papers spread around her, trying to think of what she had not yet tried, when she heard footsteps on her porch and then a knock. She opened the door and found Jasper Maddox standing there with his hat in his hands, which was unusual because he had been riding out that way and still had his coat on. He said, "Miss Mercer, I understand you are having a difficulty with the Crane situation." She looked at him. "Who told you that?" Harlan Webb mentioned it. "He is concerned as well. Billy Crane is his late wife's nephew." That was a connection she had not known about. She stepped back. "Come in." He came in, looked briefly at the papers on the table, and sat in the chair she indicated. She sat across from him and folded her hands and waited. "Ray Crane owes me labor," Jasper said. 3 days' worth from when I helped him move a section of fence last month and he did not have the cash to pay. He offered labor in trade. I have been waiting on it, but I have not pressed it. I am willing to press it now, but only if you tell me the specific repairs that are keeping Billy at home. I can arrange to come by with Crane and do those repairs myself, canceling the debt so that Crane has no remaining excuse to keep the boy home. Alice stared at him. "You would do that?" "I said I would," he said with a mild directness that was becoming familiar to her, "and I do not say things I do not mean. That is a personal policy." There was something in the way he said it, not a boast, not a performance of integrity. Just a statement of fact, quietly delivered, the way you might report the weather. She found it both extraordinary and somehow entirely credible. "The fence on the north side of his property is rotted in 3 sections," she said, because if he meant it, she was going to let him mean it. "And the door on his barn is hanging off one hinge, and he said the horse keeps getting into the feed as a result." Jasper nodded and stood up. "I will speak to Crane Monday morning." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, because she needed to know. Because she had learned to look for the hidden motive, the trap beneath the generosity, the thing someone wanted in exchange for appearing decent. He looked at her for a moment with those steady dark eyes. "Because that boy deserves to learn to read and do his arithmetic and have more choices than his father had," he said. "And because you have been fighting for that for 2 weeks and getting nowhere, and I have a tool you do not have. It is the practical thing." He put his hat on, said good night, and left. She sat at her table for a long time after he was gone. He spoke to Ray Crane Monday morning. By Tuesday, Crane had agreed to accept the fence and barn repairs in exchange for releasing the labor debt. By Wednesday, Jasper had both repairs done, working from first light. By Thursday, Billy Crane was back in school, sitting in his seat at the front of the room with his slate board, and a look on his face that was somewhere between relief and the careful neutrality of a child who has learned not to celebrate things too soon. Alice watched Billy work through his reading exercises and felt something hot and thick moving behind her eyes that she absolutely refused to let become tears in front of 17 children. She held it together through the school day and walked home in the cold December air and sat on her repaired porch in the winter dusk and let herself feel the full weight of the gratitude in something else, something warmer and more dangerous that she was not ready to name. She had not asked Jasper to do this. She had told him the information he needed because he already had a plan, and it would have been foolish not to cooperate with a good plan. But she had not asked. He had come to her. He had seen a problem and looked for a tool he had that matched it, and he had used it, and he had not made a speech about it or sent word to her in advance about what a fine thing he was doing. He had simply done it, without fanfare. She sat on the porch until the stars came out, sharp and brilliant above the desert, and she thought about the nature of promises. She had made herself a promise to be done with them. She had made it in the heat of grief and humiliation, and it was a reasonable promise given the evidence available to her at the time. But a promise, she was beginning to think, was only as good as the character of the person who made it. And perhaps she had been measuring the wrong things. Perhaps she had been listening to the volume of the promise rather than the history of the person making it. She thought about the tobacco coin left on Harlan Webb's counter. The lemon tree cleared in 9 minutes. The porch post replaced at fair rates, with lumber already measured. The fence and the barn door, and Billy craned back in his seat. None of these were promises. Not a single one of them had been offered as a promise. They had just been things he said he would do and then did, so quietly that you might miss them if you were watching for something louder. She went inside and made her coffee and admitted to herself, with the precision she brought to everything she took seriously, that she was in significant danger of falling in love with Jasper Maddox. Christmas came and went in Red Mesa with a modest celebration, a church service, a community supper at which Emmett Greer provided a side of beef. Alice brought a molasses cake that disappeared in under 10 minutes. She sat at a table with the widow Hanson and the postmaster's wife and exchanged the usual pleasantries, and she was aware of Jasper across the room, sitting at a table with 3 of the double-cross hands, listening more than he talked, which seemed to be his natural mode. At some point in the evening he came and stood near her table to speak to Gerald Potts about something, and in the general movement of people she ended up standing beside him for a moment in the way that happens at crowded events, and he said, very quietly, "Billy Crane told me he has started a reading journal, a private one. He writes in it every night." She felt the warmth hit her chest before she could manage it. "He told you that?" "He passed me on the road yesterday and stopped to say thank you. He is a serious boy." "He is a remarkable boy," she said, and because she was trying to be honest and fair, she added, "What you did made a difference. I want you to know I understand that." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted slightly, something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, as though being genuinely thanked was not something he had particularly expected. Then it settled back into that calm. "You fought for him first," he said. "I just had a lever you did not." They stood there for a moment in the noise and warmth of the community supper, and she was aware of how close he was and how easily she could have stepped away and chose not to, and how he noticed that she chose not to, and how neither of them said anything about it. January arrived with a cold that, for Arizona desert, was remarkable, and with it came a piece of information that rearranged Alice's understanding of the situation she was in. It came from the widow Hanson, who had lived in Red Mesa for 19 years and knew the history of everything within a 50-mile radius. They were drinking tea at Hanson's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon when Hanson said, in the careful way of someone offering information they have been holding for a while, "I should tell you something about the man working at the Double Cross, Jasper Maddox." Alice set down her cup. "Tell me." "He had a wife," Hanson said, "in New Mexico, 3 years ago. She died in childbirth, the baby as well." The silence that settled over the table was significant. "He does not talk about it," Hanson continued. "But I know because my cousin lives in the town he came from, a place called Silver Fork, and she wrote me when she heard he had come here. She said he has not been the same since it happened. He worked himself half to death for a year after, just to have something to do with his hands. She said he is a good man, but he has something very locked inside him now." Alice looked out the window at the cold, clear desert sky and felt a complex movement in her chest, grief, recognition, and something that felt uncomfortably like kinship. She was a woman who had been betrayed by men who made promises. He was a man who had lost the things that mattered most and had, from the sound of it, simply stopped making any particular bets on the future. They were each, in their own way, a person who had decided that expecting things led to a specific kind of pain they did not want to experience again. She went home and thought about it for a long time, and the thing she kept returning to was that his locked-away grief did not contradict anything she had observed about him. It explained it. A man who had lost a wife and child to the raw, brutal realities of frontier life, who had been left with nothing but his own hands and his own word, might reasonably decide that what he could offer was not poetry but reliability, not declarations but presence, not promises but actions. She was not sure whether she was building a story that suited her or whether she was seeing him clearly. She was aware that the distinction mattered. But she was also aware that she had 17 pieces of evidence, small and varied, all pointing in the same direction, and that the pattern they formed was not the pattern of a man who wanted to deceive her. She decided to stop avoiding the fact that she wanted to know him better. The opportunity came at the end of January in the form of a leaking schoolhouse roof that the school board finally agreed to address, primarily because the teacher's desk had a puddle under it after every rainfall and they were going to have to replace the desk if they did not fix the roof, and the desk cost more than the repair. They allocated the funds, and Alice, who knew Jasper's work from her own porch post, sought him out at the feed yard on a Friday morning. "I have a roofing job," she said, without preamble, because she had noticed he responded better to directness than to approach. "The school. 6 damaged shingles on the south side and 1 section of flashing that has separated. The school board has authorized $12 for the repair." He calculated briefly. "That is fair. I can do it Saturday morning." "Good," she said. And then, because she had made a decision and she was going to honor it without backing away, "I would like to bring coffee out to you when you have been at it a while, if that is acceptable." He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, the brief moment of recalibration when she said something unexpected. Then, "That would be welcome. I will start at 7. She brought the coffee at 9:30, when the morning had warmed enough to be pleasant and the work was well underway. She brought 2 cups and 2 slices of bread with honey because she had made too much bread, and it was practical to share it. She set it on the school steps and called up to him, and he came down the ladder with the ease of a man comfortable at heights, and they sat on the steps together in the winter sunshine and drank the coffee and ate the bread. She had planned to have a sensible, practical conversation. She had planned to talk about the school, about Billy Crane's progress, about the general state of education in Red Mesa. She talked about those things, and he listened with the attentiveness she had come to associate with him, and he asked a question about the reading material she used for the older students that demonstrated he had thought about education more than most men in town. And then they talked about other things. He had grown up in Missouri, he told her. His father had been a Methodist minister, which explained something about his relationship with stated principles. He had come west at 19 because he needed the wages, and because Missouri had felt confining in a way he could not precisely articulate at that age, though he suspected now it was simply that he needed more space. He had worked cattle in Kansas and then New Mexico, and he had been good at it, and it had given him a competence with physical work that he valued because it made him useful. He did not mention Silver Fork or anything that had happened there, and she did not ask. She told him about Abilene, about her mother, about the particular loneliness of being a capable woman in a time and place where capability was valued, but genuine independence was still viewed with suspicion. She told him that she had wanted to teach from the time she was 9 years old, that it was the one ambition she had never doubted, and that arriving in Red Mesa had confirmed that it was the right life, even if some of the peripheral aspects of living it had been harder than anticipated. He listened to all of this with a quality of attention that felt different from other attentive listeners she had known, because he was not waiting for the parts of the story that were about him, or looking for a place to offer his own competing narrative. He was simply interested in hers. When he finished the coffee, he stood up and said, "Thank you for the bread as well. I did not expect that." "It was extra," she said. "I did not want it to go to waste." He smiled at that. Not a large smile, but a genuine one, and it changed his face in a way that caught her off guard because she had not previously seen what his face did when it was fully at ease. It was a good face. She had known it was a good face, but smiling, it was something else entirely. He went back up the ladder and finished the roof. He did the work properly. She could see that even from the ground, taking care with the flashing in a way that went slightly beyond the minimum required. When he came down, he showed her the section he had repaired and explained what he had done and why, so she could understand the condition of the rest of the roof and what to watch for in future. He charged the school $11.40 and said the 60 cents were because he had used slightly less flashing material than he had estimated. She reported this to the school board with an expression of studied neutrality, but there was something lit in her chest all the way home. February in the Arizona desert was a month of strange, shifting beauty. The days could be warm enough for shirt sleeves, and the nights could still crack your water pitcher if you left it outside. The desert floor was beginning its first tentative reach toward spring, the kind of green so spare and dry it barely qualified, but unmistakably there. Alice began taking a walk in the late afternoons, after school, along the road that ran north of town toward the open land. She told herself it was for her health and for the benefit of getting out of the schoolroom before she began to feel the walls. She did not admit for several weeks that the route she took passed the eastern edge of the double-cross property, and that she had, on 6 occasions, seen Jasper working in the near pastures and exchanged a wave or a brief word through the fence. On the 7th occasion, he was mending a section of fence near the road, and he stopped when she came level with him, and they stood on either side of the weathered rails and talked for 40 minutes about books, because she had mentioned she was reading a history of the American Southwest, and he had read a portion of the same history and had opinions about its accuracy that were both specific and interesting. She walked home in the gathering dusk, feeling the particular quality of happiness that comes from a genuinely good conversation with a person whose mind you respect, and she admitted to herself that she was no longer in danger of falling in love with him. She had, at some point in the past 2 months, already done it, and the question was no longer whether but what, which was a different and considerably more frightening question. What she felt for him was not the breathless, letter-induced infatuation she had made the mistake of calling love 6 times before. It was something quieter and heavier and more real, something built from the cumulative evidence of a specific person, rather than the projected hope of an imagined one. It was the love of someone who had been watching closely, paying attention, testing what was observed against what she knew, and arriving at a conclusion that felt less like falling and more like recognizing. He was real. He was consistent. He was not performing for her. She was terrified, because she had promised herself she was done, and she was aware that being done was much easier when the right person had not yet walked 9 minutes through her fallen lemon tree and charged her 60 cents for a porch post and fixed a fence for a drunk man's son without being asked. She spent a week in a state of internal negotiation that would have been recognizable to anyone who has ever tried to argue themselves out of loving someone, which is to say, a state of complete futility. Then she stopped negotiating and started thinking practically, which was what she was actually good at. She could not know whether he felt anything for her. She had not seen clear evidence of it, or rather she had seen small things that might be evidence and might be simple human warmth, which was difficult to distinguish in a person whose warmth was already distributed evenly to everyone he encountered. She could not act on something she was not sure of. She would not pursue a man who was not interested in being pursued, because she had learned the hard way that you could not want someone into feeling something they did not feel. What she could do was be honest. She could be direct, which was his language, and she could put something clear in front of him and let him respond with the same honesty she had come to depend on from him. That was, she decided, the only approach that was consistent with who she was and what she valued. She needed an occasion. The occasion arrived in the first week of March in the form of Red Mesa's annual spring social, which was held at the community hall and involved music and dancing and a supper contributed by the women of the town. Alice had attended the previous year's social in the spirit of civic participation and spent most of it talking to the widow Hanson and going home at 9 o'clock. This year she intended to do things differently. She baked a substantial honey cake for the supper contribution. She pressed her dark blue dress, which was the nicest dress she owned, a practical but well-cut piece she had brought from Abilene that had a small amount of lace at the collar, and wrists that she usually considered faintly extravagant and tonight considered appropriate. She braided her hair and pinned it up with the 2 small amber pins that had been her mother's. She walked to the community hall in the early evening, and the first person she saw was Jasper Maddox, who was leaning against the exterior wall speaking to Emmett Greer, and who straightened fractionally when he saw her, in a way that was small enough to have been her imagination. She told herself it was not her imagination. The social was lively by Red Mesa standards, which meant there were perhaps 80 people in the hall, a fiddle player and a guitarist producing music that was enthusiastic if not technically refined, and enough whiskey flowing at the men's table to ensure the dancing would begin in earnest before 9. Alice found a place with the widow Hanson and allowed herself to be social in the way she was actually capable of when she was not bracing against something. He found her during the supper, which was perhaps 20 minutes of organized chaos during which people moved around the room with plates and the conversation became general and loud. He came to stand beside her, not dramatically, just in the way of a man who has decided where he wants to be, and he said, "Your cake is remarkable." "I had 2 pieces. That is medically inadvisable," she said. "Probably," he agreed, and they smiled at each other in the noise of the room. She gathered herself. She had rehearsed nothing because she had decided that rehearsed things went wrong, and she was going to say something real and see what happened. "I have been enjoying our conversation," she said. "The ones on the road and the one on the school steps in January. I hope they are the beginning of something rather than complete in themselves." He looked at her, and the steadiness of his gaze was absolute. "What kind of beginning?" he asked. "The kind that requires more conversations," she said. "And possibly more honey cake." Something in his face softened, not into weakness but into warmth, the same quality she had seen when he smiled on the school steps but more sustained, more directed. "I would like that," he said, "very much." "Good," she said. "Then I believe we are in agreement." "We are," he said, and then because he was himself, "May I bring anything to these conversations? Coffee, perhaps. I make reasonable coffee." "Bring the coffee," she said. "I will bring the bread." They shook hands on it, which made her laugh, which made him smile that full smile again, and she thought that this was possibly the most reasonable courtship arrangement she had ever entered into, which was exactly why she was more hopeful about it than any of the others. March became April, and the conversations multiplied. He came to her door on Sunday mornings with coffee, and she had bread, and they sat on her porch in the returning warmth and talked, and then walked, and then talked some more. They talked about everything, the nature of good work and what made it satisfying, the particular cruelty of the Copper Mines Company store system, and whether the men who worked there had any real options, the question of whether Arizona Territory would achieve statehood and what difference it would make, the books they had both read, the books she thought he should read and pressed on him from her lending library, his memories of Missouri and her memories of Abilene. He was a careful man. He did not rush her or press her toward anything she had not already moved toward on her own. When he walked her home, he stopped at the gate, and when he left cleanly, no manufactured lingering. She noticed this with a gratitude that was almost painful in its intensity, because she understood that a man who had been hurt deeply had his own forms of guardedness, his own reasons for moving slowly, and that the slowness was not indifference. She knew about Silver Fork without either of them having mentioned it. She was waiting for him to tell her when he was ready, because she understood that things which have been buried deep enough to be carried for 3 years require something specific before they can be said out loud. They require trust, and trust cannot be manufactured. He told her in April, on a Sunday afternoon when they had walked farther than usual, and ended up sitting on a flat red rock above the town with the desert spreading gold and rust-colored in every direction, and the sky a blue so pure it was almost aggressive. He said, "There is something I should tell you, because I think we are moving toward something real and you should know it before we go further." "Yes," she said simply. He told her about Silver Fork, about a woman named Clara, whom he had loved with the complete confidence of a young man who has not yet encountered the limits of what love can hold back, about the pregnancy, which they had been glad about, both of them, about the night in October of 1880 when the labor came and did not go the way it should have, and by morning there was nothing left of either of them, about the year that followed, which he described in 3 sentences, each one flat and controlled in a way that told her how much was behind them. She did not say, "I am sorry," though she was. She did not say, "I understand," though she did. She sat with the information and let it be real, let the weight of it exist between them without trying to diminish or explain it, and after a while she said, "Is that why you came here? To be somewhere no one knew about it?" "Partly," he said, "and partly because New Mexico had started to feel like a place where I was only the shape of what I used to be. I needed somewhere I could be something else." "Have you found that?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen from him, and in it she could see the grief and the long months of solitary work, and the careful rebuild of a man who had decided to keep living with whatever he had left. "I am finding it," he said. She reached over and put her hand on top of his where it rested on the rock, not as a statement but as the physical expression of what she could not quite say, which was that she saw him, all of him, including the parts that had been broken and were now mended in the honest, visible way of things that have been broken and have healed rather than being hidden away. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that on the red rock above Red Mesa, while the afternoon light changed, and the desert did the things the desert does when no one is performing for it. Spring deepened into a full, warm May, and the thing between them deepened with it, building in layers of shared experience and accumulated small kindnesses that she had stopped trying to resist and started simply receiving, because she had realized that resistance was not the same as wisdom. Being closed was not the same as being careful. She had thought they were the same, back in November when she burned Clifton Reed's letter, but they were not. Being careful meant paying attention and trusting what the evidence showed. Being closed meant refusing to look at the evidence at all. She was looking. Everything she saw confirmed what she already knew. He was a man who did what he said he would do. He was a man who noticed what needed doing and did it without ceremony. He was a man who had been hurt to his foundations and had rebuilt himself on a basis of action rather than declaration, because declarations had not been able to save what he loved, and actions at least gave you something to do with your hands. One evening in mid-May she was working at her kitchen table, marking the spring examinations her students had sat that afternoon, and there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Jasper standing on her porch in the last of the day's light with a small object in his hand. It was a seed packet. "I was at the hardware store in Tucson this week," he said by way of explanation, because Emmett Greer had sent him to fetch some fencing materials that needed to be collected in person. "They had a variety of lemon tree from a California grower. I was told it does well in this soil." She looked at the seed packet, then at him. The lemon tree, the original tree that had fallen in the frost in November, the same tree he had cleared from her porch in 9 minutes on the morning they properly met. He had held that in his memory for 6 months and found a replacement, and brought it to her without comment or ceremony, just a matter-of-fact offering in the last of the May evening light. She took the packet from him. It was small and ordinary, with a paper wrapper and hand-printed text, the kind of thing that cost perhaps 2 or 3 cents. He had carried it from Tucson without saying anything to her about it in advance. He had not said, "I will bring you a replacement for your tree." He had just brought it. She held the seed packet and felt the thing she had been so determined to be done with, the thing she had locked away in November with the ashes of Clifton Reed's letter, come flooding back through her. But it was different this time. It was not the desperate, brittle hope of a woman waiting to be disappointed. It was the deep, grounded warmth of a woman standing on her own porch, holding her own ground, looking at a man who had learned a different language for care and was speaking it to her consistently, reliably, without fanfare. "Come in," she said. "I have coffee on the stove." He came in and they sat at her kitchen table, and the examination papers were pushed to one side and they drank the coffee, and she said, "When should I plant it?" "Now is a good time," he said. "The ground is warm enough. I can help you with the placement if you want. It should get the morning light but be sheltered from the afternoon heat while it is getting established." "Yes," she said. "I would like your help with the placement." They planted the lemon tree that Saturday, choosing a spot slightly south of where the original had stood, sheltered on one side by the angle of the house. He dug the planting hole with the correct depth, and she set the pot in place, and they tamped the earth together and watered it with careful, deliberate measures, and she thought that this was exactly what building something looked like. Not the moment of declaration. The actual digging and tamping and watering. "Jasper," she said, while they were washing their hands at the pump afterward. "Yes." "I love you," she said, in the same tone she used when stating a clear fact to her students. Because it was a clear fact, and she saw no particular reason to dress it in anything it did not need. He went still for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her, and his face was doing the thing again, the thing it did when she surprised him, and she could see in his expression the particular complexity of a man for whom love had previously ended in catastrophe, and who was being required to decide in real time whether he was willing to step toward it again. He said, "I have been working up to saying that to you for 2 months. "I know," she said. "I could tell." "I was afraid," he said, and the honesty of it, the clean, direct acknowledgement, was so characteristic of him that she felt it like a hand around her heart. "I was afraid too," she said. "I am less afraid now." "I love you," he said, in the careful, weighted way of a man who does not say things he does not mean, and for whom this particular sentence has not been said in 3 years, and for whom saying it is therefore both a great gift and an act of considerable courage. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her, there beside the pump and the small new lemon tree in the warm May afternoon, and it was not a dramatic scene. There was no audience. The neighbors were inside or elsewhere. The moment was ordinary in its externals and entirely extraordinary in its substance, which she thought was the best possible kind of moment. June came, and July, and the relationship between Alice Mercer and Jasper Maddox became a known thing in Red Mesa in the way that things become known in small towns, incrementally and inevitably. The widow Hanson expressed her approval so warmly it bordered on proprietary. Gerald Potts at the post office offered his congratulations unprompted. Harlan Webb at the general store gave Alice a significant nod the next time she came in, which from Harlan constituted something approaching a standing ovation. Billy Crane, who had finished the school year with marks that made Alice genuinely proud, and who had presented her with a small carved figure of a horse he had made himself as a year-end gift, told Jasper gravely one afternoon that Miss Mercer was the best person he had ever met, and that he hoped Jasper was going to do right by her. Jasper apparently took this very seriously, because when he told Alice about it that evening, sitting on her porch in the July warmth, he said it with an expression that suggested Billy Crane's opinion mattered to him considerably. "What did you tell him?" Alice asked. "I told him that was my intention," Jasper said, "and that he had good judgment." "He does," she agreed. "So do you," he said, In most things, she raised an eyebrow, in most things. You held out for a very long time before admitting you could tolerate my company. I would characterize that differently, she said. I was being appropriately careful. You were being a fortress, he said, with the mildness that made it not unkind. A very reasonable, well-defended fortress. A fortress that let you in, she pointed out. Eventually, he said. She threw a dish towel at him, which she had brought outside for some now-forgotten practical reason, and he caught it without looking because his reflexes were good, and this also, unreasonably, delighted her. They were happy. She had not expected, a year ago, to be able to say that with any confidence, but here it was. They were genuinely, straightforwardly happy with each other in the way of two people who have been honest from the beginning, and have therefore not had to maintain any complicated fictions. The happiness was not a performance, and it did not require maintenance. It was simply the condition that resulted from being consistently and truthfully themselves in each other's presence. He proposed in August. It was not a formal proposal, with advance orchestration. They had been sitting outside after supper, which had become a habit on warm evenings, he having brought a rabbit he had snared that she had made into a stew that was, she thought, one of her better efforts. The stars were out and the desert was doing its nighttime cooling, and she was reading by lamplight while he was looking at the sky in the unhurried way he had of being in a space without needing to fill it. He said, "I would like to marry you." She looked up from her book. "I have thought about it carefully," he said. "I am not asking because it is the expected thing, or because I think you need something from me that you do not already have. I am asking because I want to build a life with you specifically, and I want to do it in the legitimate and committed way, and I want you to know that when I say I will be there, I mean it for the rest of my life." She set the book face down on her knee. "That is the most honest proposal I have ever heard," she said. "Is it the only proposal you have heard?" "No," she said. "The others were considerably more florid and considerably less sincere." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "Yes," she said. "I would like to marry you." They were married in October, exactly 1 year after she had burned Clifton Reed's letter in the post office stove. The ceremony was performed by a minister who passed through Red Mesa quarterly for exactly this kind of occasion. It was held at the schoolhouse, which Alice cleaned and decorated with desert flowers and the branches of a Mexican elder that smelled faintly of honey. The widow Hanson stood with Alice, and one of the double-cross hands stood with Jasper, and Billy Crane sat in the front row with his eyes wide and attentive. Alice wore the dark blue dress with the amber pins in her hair. She had thought about buying a different dress, something newer, and had decided the blue dress was honest. It was the dress she had worn when she first really talked to him, and she wanted to be married in something true. He wore a clean white shirt and his best vest, and his hat was in his hands for the entire ceremony, which she noticed because she always noticed the hat. He looked at her throughout with an expression of such complete and undisguised intention that she felt entirely certain, in a way she had never felt certain about a human being before, that she was looking at the rest of her life. The minister said the words, and they said their words, and Jasper placed on her finger a simple gold band he had purchased from a jeweler in Tucson. Not ornate, not flashy, just a clean and solid piece of gold that was meant to last. There was a reception afterward in the schoolhouse, to which the whole of Red Mesa appeared to have been invited, judging by the number of people who showed up with food. Someone produced a fiddle, and someone else produced a guitar, and there was dancing on the swept wood floor that went until well past 10 o'clock, which was ambitious for a weekday evening in a cattle town. Alice danced with her husband and thought about the word husband, which she was going to need some time to fully absorb, and she thought about promises. She had been done with promises. She had made herself a commitment to that and had held it honestly and well for 3 weeks, until a man who made almost no promises at all had shown her, incrementally and without drama, what it looked like when a person's word meant something. He had not promised her everything would be perfect. He had not promised her a future painted in the colors she wanted. He had promised her, in the clearest possible language, that he would be there, and he had spent a year demonstrating, in actions so small and consistent they could almost be mistaken for unremarkable, that this was not an empty word. They moved her things into the larger house that Jasper had arranged to rent from Emmett Greer, a solid structure 2 miles from town with proper rooms and a good well and a barn for the horse Jasper kept. She kept the school and her position, because Jasper had never suggested otherwise and would have been surprised if she had thought he would, and the riding distance was manageable. She planted the lemon tree in the yard of the new house, in a south-facing spot with morning light and afternoon shelter, and it took root and did what lemon trees do, quietly and without fanfare. November arrived, and with it a realization she mentioned to him on a Tuesday morning over coffee in the kitchen, stating it as the clear fact she had verified and confirmed before saying anything, which was her approach to most things. He set down his cup and looked at her, and she watched him process it, watched the thing move through his face, which was not the thing she had feared might be there, the shadow of old loss and old grief, but was instead something different. Something that looked like a man who had spent 3 years in the desert learning to live without water, and who was now being told there was a spring. "Alice," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. "I am not afraid," he said, which was perhaps the most important thing he could have said and the most honest, because they both knew that he had reason to be afraid and that it took something specific to say he was not. "I am a little afraid," she admitted. "That's sensible," he said. "We will be careful. We will have Dr. Henning from Tucson when the time comes. We will prepare properly." "Yes," she said, "we will." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the November kitchen while the Arizona morning light came through the window, and they were both thinking the same thing, which was that the future had arrived unexpectedly, and they were going to meet it with their eyes open. They wrote to Dr. Henning in Tucson that week, and arranged in advance for him to come when the time was close. Alice reduced her teaching hours in the final months and arranged with a young woman from town, a sharp 18-year-old named Ruth Whitfield, who had been one of Alice's own students before Alice arrived and who had genuine teaching ability, to take the school for the spring term while Alice recovered. The winter was a good one, warm for Arizona, which meant the nights were cold but manageable, and the days had a golden clarity that made the desert beautiful in its spare way. Alice was healthy and organized and made a science of her preparations. Jasper built a cradle from pine, solid and carefully finished, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. He did not tell her he was making it until it was done, which was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. It was a very good cradle. In March of 1885, on a clear morning with the desert beginning to push out its earliest tentative green, Alice gave birth to a son. Dr. Henning had arrived 4 days before, at Jasper's insistence, and the birth was managed as safely as anything could be managed in a territorial house in Arizona in 1885, which was to say with skill and care and considerable prayer. It was not without difficulty, and it was not without fear, particularly at certain moments when Jasper, waiting outside the door in the manner of the time, sat with his hands clasped between his knees and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is refusing with everything he has to imagine the worst. And then Alice called for him, which was not exactly the established practice, but she was Alice and she operated by her own determinations, and he came in, and the doctor handed him a small, red-faced, vigorous boy who was demonstrating his vigorous nature at full volume. Jasper held his son and said nothing for a long time. Alice, exhausted and relieved in watching him from the bed, saw everything he was not saying move across his face in the slow and private language of a man who does not speak his deepest things aloud, and she understood every word of it. They named him Thomas, for no particular reason except that they both liked it, and Thomas Maddox arrived in the world in the same way his father operated, unceremoniously, soundly, and with a great deal of determination. The years that followed were full ones. Real ones. The kind of life that is not a story but is instead a living thing, irregular and imperfect, and shot through with moments of such particular happiness that Alice, who was not prone to sentiment in the formal sense, occasionally stopped in the middle of an ordinary task to register it deliberately, the way you might look up at a remarkable sky to make sure you are actually seeing it. Jasper bought the Double Cross's eastern parcel from Emmett Greer in 1886, when Greer was expanding in a different direction and wanted to offload the acreage. It was 30 acres of decent grazing land with a reliable water source, not a large operation by any measure, but real and growing and entirely theirs. Jasper ran cattle on it, and Alice, who had returned to full teaching the autumn after Thomas was born, ran the school with a staff that now included Ruth Whitfield on a permanent basis. Billy Crane graduated, in the sense that a frontier education in 1885 had a graduation, with an understanding of mathematics and rhetoric and history that Alice was privately certain exceeded that of many men twice his age. He went to work at the telegraph office in Tucson at 16, a position that required precisely the kind of careful literacy she had spent years building in him. He wrote her a letter when he arrived that was careful and clear and signed with a formality she found deeply touching. William Crane, which was not what anyone had ever called him, but which was who he intended to be. She kept the letter in a box with the amber pins and the paper seed packet from the lemon tree. Thomas Maddox was 4 years old when his parents told him he was going to have a brother or a sister, a piece of information he received with the solemn consideration of a child who takes everything seriously and has clearly inherited his father's capacity for stillness. He decided after thought that a brother would be preferable, and he stated this position calmly and without negotiation. He got a sister. Her name was Clara, which Alice had suggested quietly one evening, watching Jasper's face to see what it carried, and he had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Yes, if it's a girl, let it be Clara," and she had heard in those words everything that could be said about the distance a person can travel in 4 years between grief and grace. Clara Maddox arrived in September of 1888, a firm and curious baby who almost immediately demonstrated that she was going to be considerably more energetic than her brother, and who had, from her first weeks, a quality of looking at the world as though she found it personally interesting, and intended to investigate every part of it. Thomas, who had stated a preference for a brother, adjusted to Clara with the pragmatic resilience of a frontier child, and within a month was showing her things, which was the beginning of a relationship between them that was characterized, as far as Alice could observe, by an equal mixture of exasperation and genuine protection. The lemon tree in the yard of the house produced its first fruit in the spring of 1887, 3 years after Alice planted it, which was about the right timeline for a lemon tree getting established in desert conditions. Jasper brought her the first lemon with the same gravity he brought everything, setting it on the kitchen table without comment while she was writing her school lesson plans, and she looked at it and looked at him and felt the full weight of everything it represented: the November morning, the fallen tree, the seed packet from Tucson, the years of slow and honest building. "Thank you," she said. "For the lemon." "For all of it," she said. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where they had drunk coffee and planned a school board campaign, and talked through every difficulty they had encountered, and some they had invented just to think through together. He looked at her with the same steady regard that had been consistent since the first morning on her porch, the thing that did not age or diminish with familiarity, the attentiveness that had never been a performance and was therefore still present when performances would have faded. "I could say the same to you," he said. "You let me back in after everything." "You were not the one who closed the door," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I was the one carrying enough damage to walk through it and close it from the inside. You did not let me do that." "You did not want to," she said. "I think that matters." "It does," he said. "You did too. You could have kept being a fortress." "Fortunately," she said, "I had a very persistent lemon tree situation." He laughed, which was still one of the most satisfying sounds she knew, partly because it was not a frequent sound and was therefore never cheapened by overuse. She reached across the table and took the lemon, which was small and slightly misshapen, and smelled exactly as a lemon should, sharp and clean and clear, and she thought this was the best possible emblem for what they had built together. Not perfect in its shape, perfect in its substance. The years continued to be full. In 1889, Arizona Territory was still a territory, statehood not arriving until 1912, a fact that Alice and Jasper both lived to see. But in the meantime, there was sufficient life to engage with. The school grew. Red Mesa itself grew, the population pushing past 600 by the early 1890s as the copper mine expanded, and a spur rail line was connected to the main Southern Pacific route, which brought new families and new commerce and new complications. Alice advocated for and won a new school building in 1891, a genuine brick structure with 2 rooms and proper windows, and a real library room in the back that she stocked with books ordered from suppliers in St. Louis and San Francisco. She fought the school board for this with the patient, documented, relentless determination she brought to anything she decided mattered, and she won because she always came prepared, and she never made it personal, and she simply kept returning with more evidence until the evidence was incontrovertible. Jasper doubled the acreage of their ranch by 1892, adding another 22 acres from a neighbor who was retiring back east. He hired 2 men to work with him, one of whom was a young man named Aurelio Garcia from a Mexican family who had farmed in the territory for 3 generations, and who had a knowledge of the land and the water that was worth considerably more than any wage Jasper was paying him. This was a thing Jasper understood and stated plainly to Aurelio, and their working relationship was characterized by the mutual respect of 2 men who knew what they knew and did not waste time on pretense. Billy Crane, now William, visited in the summer of 1893 from Tucson, where he had been promoted to chief telegraph operator and was, he told them over supper, engaged to be married to a woman named Margaret Orozco, whose father ran a printing business. He was 23 years old, and he sat at Alice's table and ate her stew and talked about his future with the quiet confidence of a young man who has been taught that he is capable of having one. And Alice sat across from him, feeling something that was not quite maternal pride, but was certainly something in that territory, and thought about the fence and the barn door and the $9 she had spent on chalk and slate boards in the first year of her teaching, and how impossible it was to trace the real lines of cause and effect when it came to a human life. The supper table that evening had Jasper at one end and Thomas at the other, 9 years old, and asking William questions about telegraph machines with the focused intensity he brought to anything mechanical. Clara was 4 and had fallen asleep in her chair, an event that had been witnessed by everyone, and that no one had commented on because Clara had opinions about being put to bed, and this seemed like a peaceful resolution. Alice looked at her table, at her children and her husband and Billy Crane grown into William, and she thought, this is what the 7 broken promises were in exchange for. This is what came after. It was, she thought, an entirely reasonable trade. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, they had a habit of sitting on the back porch together, not always talking. Sometimes she would read and he would look at the stars in that unhurried way of his, or he would be working through the ranch accounts and she would be writing letters to her school board contacts in Phoenix or Tucson or planning the following week's lessons. Just being together in the same space, doing the separate things that made up a life, connected by the reliable, unglamorous, deeply sustaining fact of each other's presence. On one such evening in the summer of 1894, Alice set down her book and looked at the lemon tree, which was now a full and healthy tree producing more fruit than they could use, which meant she had taken to leaving bags of lemons at Harlan Webb's store for people to take, and she said, "Do you remember the seed packet?" "Yes," he said without looking up from the accounts. "I still have it," she said, "in the box with the amber pins." He looked up then. "Do you?" "I have kept it since the day you brought it," she said. "I thought you should know that." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that still caught her, even after all the years and all the daily proximity, the expression that was not exactly surprise but was the look of a man who finds, regularly and without diminishing returns, that the person he married continues to be someone he is deeply glad he did not talk himself out of. "I brought it because I thought it was the practical thing," he said. "You needed a tree. I found a tree." "I know," she said. "That is exactly why I kept it." He put down the accounts and reached over and took her hand, the same gesture from the Red Rock in April of 1884, the same warmth and weight of it, unchanged by time in the way of things that have been made of something real. The desert night was full of stars. The lemon tree was full of fruit. The house behind them held two sleeping children, a boy who wanted to understand machines and a girl who intended to investigate everything, and the future was a long, open, particular thing that belonged to all of them. Alice Mercer Maddox sat on her back porch and held her husband's hand and thought about promises. She had been done with promises once. She had been sure of it, standing in the post office with the ashes of a letter she did not want anymore and the solid, private conviction that she was through with hoping for what was said and was going to live instead by what was actual. She had been right about that. She had not been wrong. The conviction had been sound, the instinct good. What she had not known then was that there was a specific kind of man who made very few promises, but who had spent his entire life demonstrating that when his word was given, it was given completely, and who would walk 9 minutes into a fallen lemon tree on a frost-cold morning and fix things quietly and charge fair rates and bring coffee to a school roof and arrange to repair a drunk man's fence for a boy who deserved to learn to read, and who would find a lemon tree in a hardware store in Tucson and carry the seed packet home without saying anything about it in advance, because it was simply the practical thing, and hand it to her in the last of the evening light, and that would be the thing that mattered, not a promise made, a small thing done, and then another, until the accumulation of them was so solid and evident and undeniable that even a woman who had built a fortress out of reasonable grief could see, clearly and without illusion, what it was. The desert was quiet and wide. The stars were doing their reliable work. The lemon tree moved slightly in the night breeze, and the fruit caught the light from the porch lamp and glowed yellow gold in the dark, consistent and abundant and beautifully, uselessly generous with its offering. Alice held her husband's hand and was grateful for the specific shape of the life she had built, which looked nothing like the one she had imagined when she came to Red Mesa in 1882, and everything like the one she actually wanted, and she thought that this was perhaps the best surprise available to a person. To discover that what you needed was not what you had thought to ask for, but had been offered to you anyway, quietly, without fanfare, by someone who did not make speeches but who showed up every single time. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and that was all, and it was enough, and it was everything.